All right, our next talk is from Arthur Dawson, who actually submitted a talk to the call for talks before COVID, and I said, "Oh, I'm planning on doing a fire session next time. Can you speak then?" And he said, "Sure." And then 5, 6 years later, I came back and was like, "I'm doing the fire session now." And he was like, "Oh, I can speak now." So I'm very appreciative because I've wanted to hear this for almost half a decade, or over half a decade. He is a historical archaeologist with Baseline Consulting. He works consulting in historical ecology in Northern California and is currently working for the Sonoma Land Trust on a project in the Sonoma Baylands. Please welcome Arthur.
Thank you, Jane. And I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a historical ecologist, which sometimes people mistake me for a hysterical ecologist, but I'm not that. So thank you very much for having me here. It's a great honor to be back at Chico. I went to school here for a number of years. And I'd like to share with you some of the research I've done recently in the Mayacamas, funded by CAL FIRE. And I worked with, my little consulting firm is Baseline Consulting, and I worked with Pepperwood Preserve, which is also in Sonoma County, and with Jim Thorne, who's at UC Davis, and then Mark Tuckman of Tuckman Geospatial. Let's see, figure out the technology here. So the overall study that CAL FIRE funded was much more than I'm going to talk about here because it would take way too much time. But there were 4 study areas in Sonoma, Napa, and Lake County, and I'm going to just talk about the Sonoma-Napa study area. It's about 30,000 acres, and it straddles the ridge between the 2 counties. So the idea of this study was to look at the long-range changes and patterns of vegetation and also fire and see what they had to say to each other. So for a study covering that much time requires using lots of different sources. So that part can get a little tricky. But for vegetation, there's a number of vegetation maps going back to the early 20th century. And then if you go before that, there's government surveys, which actually have a lot of vegetation data. And for fire, we have CAL FIRE maps, which are excellent, starting in the 1940s, more or less. And if you go back before that, then there's actually quite a bit of data contained in newspaper articles. So they'll mention certain places a fire burned, they'll give you the size of the fire, and by mapping all that out, you can do an estimated fire perimeter going all the way back to the late 19th century. But I want to start with the thread right in the middle there, the indigenous wisdom, which really contains both fire and vegetation, and they're closely related. I was lucky enough to talk to a number of indigenous elders, and I also talked to some local folks too over the years, working as a historical ecologist. So local knowledge, even if it's not indigenous, some people had memories that went back 80 years or even multi-generational memories of what had been seen on the landscape. So starting with indigenous wisdom, the indigenous people understand there's a real relationship between fire, vegetation, and people, and they all interact with each other. And one of the most interesting people I talked to, one of the people I'm most grateful to have a chance to have a long conversation with was Clint McKay, who's on the advisory council at Pepperwood. And this picture is of him lighting a pile burn at Pepperwood Preserve with his family, which is really, that's back in the day, this is how people burned the landscape, was, in their family groups. And one thing, he made a real distinction between prescriptive burning, which he described as, meant to benefit people for the most part, and cultural burning, which is intended to benefit all the living things on the land. I also talked to Sarah Moncada, who's at Heron Shadow, which is a site in western Sonoma County dedicated to benefiting indigenous people, and they use a variety of management techniques. But I just love this quote. We consider fire to be a member of the community, one who is far wiser and more powerful than we are. And just the idea that fire could be a member of the community, that people and fire and plants and animals are all part of the same community, I think is a powerful statement. I'm not sure how Smokey the Bear would feel about it, but I just think it's it was so interesting to talk to these indigenous folks and just to try to expand my mind as far as how they saw the landscape. And this was a really key quote. So, what it came down to, at least this is what I came away from those conversations with, is, really thinking about what's our proper role in the landscape. Are we trying to control it? And I think in recent years we've learned that we're really not in control. Look at LA right now. Or are we looking for a relationship? Looking for a role in the landscape that's going to help to steward it and maintain balance. And one other indigenous elder I talked to was Redbird, and he's also at Heron Shadow. And I showed him the maps that you're going to see in a minute. Vegetation changes over the years, and he said, well, that's how it looks when it's not being tended properly. For him, it was very clear this was the result of the landscape being poorly tended. And to give you an example, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Got to find that. So these pictures here, this is along a survey line that was described in 1870 as covered with chamizal, which is chamise. And now it's covered with Douglas fir. You can even find the bones of chaparral in this forest, so evidence that they were there. Oak trees and fir trees are the dominant species now. So let's go now into the historical record, take a look at the fire history. So what I did is I took those data sources, took all the fire perimeters, and then this map just shows how they overlapped, and you can see there's a very clear an area where there was 5 to 7 fires, all happened in this one part of the study area. And then over here, there's no recorded fires up there. And these areas are not that far apart. There's a lot of variability in the fire history in this landscape, and I'm guessing that's probably true over much of California. I should mention this study area does straddle the ridgetop, so this is west facing on this side, and this is east facing on this side. So obviously you're going to have different microclimates on those sides, but still it surprises me how different the fire history was in these two places. Okay, going to the vegetation data. And just a brief intro to that, it's tricky to look at vegetation data from over a long period of time that's collected with, different techniques and different reasons. For the most part, all the data collected from the early 20th century forward can be put into, MCV classifications or WHR. We use WHR vegetation maps for part of this. And then if you go back before that to the early surveys, the surveyors actually described the vegetation. They mentioned species, but the best way that I could think of to really bring it all together so that there weren't making wild speculations about what they were recording was to just plot it into the MCV life form classifications. So basically short stuff, medium stuff, and tall stuff. And I apologize to plant taxonomists out there because I absolutely love plant taxonomy, but this is what we had to come to for this study. So here's the vegetation over 150 years. The legend at the top. So you see orange is shrub, and you've got a couple different kinds of forests, and then these other categories are relatively minor. And in this map right here, what you're seeing, these lines are the township and range lines that you see on a topo map. And the survey notes, you can get the survey notes, and at the end of every mile of survey, they were required to record the vegetation in the order of abundance. That's a direct quote from the survey manual. So you can take that and start plotting out, what was the life form, and you can see there's a lot of shrubbery, quite a bit of forest, and it's not that different than the picture in 1932. But what's interesting, you come ahead to 1932, this is from the Wieslander maps, there was a big fire in 1923. So I think the most fruitful way to think of these is not so much by calendar year as by years post-major fire. So 1932 is 9 years post-fire, And you can see lots of chaparral, more or less maybe balanced between chaparral and woodland. And then, but come ahead 20 more years post-fire. So this is 1993, but it's 29 years past another big fire in 1964. And you can see that the chaparral is beginning to fill in. A lot of it's going to conifers and firs. And then if you go ahead another 20 years post-fire, you've got, the chaparral is almost disappearing here. And the firs and the other conifers are really spreading out. And this is the landscape just right on the cusp of another major fire. So 2017, the wine country fires, and this is what the landscape looked like. And I believe Mark Tuckman is working on an updated vegetation map, and I'm going to be very curious to see, my guess is, because we're now about 7 or 8 years past the last fire, that it's going to look something like this, that we're going to see this pattern getting repeated. Okay, so bringing these together, let's take a look at the frequent burn zone. And you can see that 9 years post-fire, it's primarily shrub, 75% shrub. Go ahead another 20 years post-fire, and now the forest is beginning to fill in the shrubs, and the shrubs have gone from 3/4 down to 1/4, more or less. And then 49 years post-fire, it's very little shrub left, 13%. And another way to look at it is, so there's the chaparral, the shrub is the orange line here, then the two kinds of forest, and then the brown is the combination coverage by the forest. And you can see I think of this as sort of a teeter-totter. After the fire, the amount of shrub goes up, but as time goes on, the amount of forest begins to fill in, and somewhere around 20 years, they come into some sort of a rough balance. And then after that, the forest dominates the landscape, and then the shrub get down to a very minor component, and then there's another fire, and my guess is and I've seen this myself actually, there's already lots of shrub. It's tipping the other way. So here's someone who remembered the 1964 fire, and he talked about how quickly things came back, and in fact, this is what we saw in 2018, so the spring after the 2017 fire. It's just a few months later. The chamise is really sprouting out from the roots. A lot of wildflowers that had not been seen, or at least had not been common before that, growing in these areas. Here's some burned forest. I think this is knobcone forest. So, a lot of change and a lot of sort of a beginning of the cycle again. And to compare the cycle that I've been talking about with what was the cycle happening during indigenous times, as best I can tell, as not being an indigenous person, but looking at all the data. So what we're seeing recently, I'm going to call an untended cycle. There was fire suppression, but beyond that, there really was no tending of the landscape. And you can see this starts out, mostly chaparral after a fire, a little bit of forest, and the forest slowly fills in, and then there's another fire, and I sort of think of this as like a clock ticking. But in the indigenous tradition, they were burning. Clint wouldn't give me a number of years, but I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 years, give or take a few, is probably what they were doing. And so that kept the landscape kind of short-circuited the cycle and kept it in a shorter time frame. And over here on the left, this is what the landscape looked like up in the frequent burn zone, but 3 years before the fire. So I just happened to be up there and took some pictures, not knowing that's what it was at that time, but you can see this is chamise. There's also manzanita. There's Douglas firs coming up through the manzanita and through the chaparral. And there's even some bay trees. There are quite a few bays growing up and through the chaparral. So very thick. When I was up there, I just got this sense that this landscape wanted to burn at that time. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that was true. So one more. Okay, this is way too complicated to try to explain right now. But I think the takeaway from this is that the annual rate of change in the frequent burn zone is much faster than in the rare burn zone. So, 3 times things are happening, vegetation change is happening 3 times faster here than over here. And I think there might be something there as far as thinking about fuels management, and also thinking about conservation of certain plant types and all kinds of things. I think it's worth thinking about that. Okay, and last slide. I want to leave you with the place that the information that Clint gave me overlapped with the historical record. So he mentioned how they used to burn from the bottom of the slope up to the top, which you mostly can't do anymore. There's too much fuel. And what happens is at the top of a slope, there's a natural fire break. And so that's where the Douglas fir would get established. There's a little refuge for Douglas fir up there. And then if they drop seeds, well, the next time it burned, all the seedlings on the slope would be burned. But they would establish themselves up there. And you can see in this is where the Douglas fir were in 1870, just high up on these ridges. These other lines, this is where the Douglas fir were later, so the other colors. But where you see green up here, that's where the Douglas fir were in 1870. So really high up. And then this was just before the recent fires, and Douglas fir are all over the place, and even creeping down into the edges of more populated areas, which I think is probably something to think about. And we'll see the next vegetation map that comes out. We'll see how this looks, but I'm imagining a lot of this is not Douglas fir now. It's mostly chaparral. Okay, time for questions, and thank you for listening.
Don, where I used to work back east, we would use historical photography from the 1930s and 1940s to map wetlands and those types of things. Have you used any historical aerial photography for quality control or estimating cover or community types?
I have not for this particular project, although a lot of the later the vegetation maps, particularly from the 1950s on, used aerial photography. So it's a secondary product, but in that sense, I was using aerial photography. And I did use it at Pepperwood Preserve to plot the changes in the grasslands. And so going back to 1942, you can see there's good aerial photography from World War II. So that's a valuable source, yes, absolutely.
Could you comment about your ideas of burn cycles and vegetation prior to indigenous burning?
I haven't really looked into that. I think it's, it was a different world back then. It was probably the Ice Age, so vastly different climate. And I think, one of the conclusions that I've come to that I think a lot of other people have is that really, California is, when Europeans got here, it was a cultural landscape. The vegetation patterns were largely cultural at some level. And I'm not sure, it's interesting, but I'm not sure how valuable it is for us now to try to figure out what that was. Yeah, right here.
I was wondering if you can comment on just how would you reconcile the idea that obligate seeding manzanitas require much longer time fire intervals with the cycles of indigenous burning, and how we can move forward with managing these fire-intense landscapes and the people that live right around them.
That's a good question. I'd have to dig into. That's not something I looked at specifically. I can tell you that going back to the 1870s, there were manzanita in the study area, and that was recorded by the surveyors. And I know there were both obligate cedars and then also stump sprouting manzanitas in the area. I haven't tried to parse that out. So that's a good question and demands more study, I'd say. Absolutely. Any other questions? One last question. All right, over here.
Where are you?
Making you walk.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I've actually seen an earlier version of this instant of this talk you gave. So I'm interested in the fire-maintained landscape. And so in this scenario, we've got Doug fir mostly on the ridge types, and the shrubs and grasslands being maintained by fire. And I know that you want the fewer categories because less chance for error. But I'm wondering, with the fire coming in, if coast redwoods might have been the dominant conifers. Do any of the vegetation reports specify what kind of conifers?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is a very high level look, but a very crude and rough look as well. Yeah, in most cases, the conifers are in the early surveys are predominantly Douglas fir. Occasionally, you get something like pine, which you have to try to decide is that a ghost pine or something else. Occasionally, there's things like cedar, which there's ambiguity in the survey notes, but it's pretty clear it's some kind of conifer. But the redwoods they knew, they're mentioned, but mostly down in the canyons. In this particular study site, the redwoods, there's a canyons along the west side here, and there's more redwoods on the east side, of course, because it's cooler over there. So there were some redwoods, and there's a few redwoods on the west side, but yeah, they weren't particularly widespread. This is getting toward the edge of their range. The edge of the redwood range is another maybe 5 or 10 miles to the east, so they're pretty close to the edge of their range. All right, thank you very much.